Another Jeepin' with Cool Guy video. What else have you got to do with your time? Alright, on tonight's episode of Jeepin' with Cool Guy, this is part 2 of the T150 rebuild. This episode is all going to be focused around putting it all back together, the reassembly process. I've got everything to where I want it to be, meaning that I've taken the housing and the shift control cap and I've cleaned them all up. I've degreased them, scrubbed them down. I've lightly sanded down the surfaces of where the gaskets would be, and then I powder coated the whole thing, and it looks really, really good. I've ordered in the parts that I needed to replace, which would be the reverse idler gear. I got the overhaul kit, or the rebuild kit, which consisted of the bearings and a lot of the split rings and the needle bearings, and a few other little minor pieces. We'll get to that in a little while, but it's really interesting just to be able to try and find some of these things, because there doesn't seem to be a kit that is specifically and only for the T150. Some of the kits have extra pieces, some of the kits don't have enough of the pieces. Let's go ahead and start with the transmission control housing. First thing you're going to want to do is gather up all of your little pieces that we didn't get rid of, and I couldn't find a replacement set for. So you want to make sure that you save your poppet springs, and I guess this is probably called a poppet, but this is the piece that goes in between this rail that makes sure that the two shift forks don't activate at the same time. And then we've also got our roll pins that hold the shift forks into place. Got our two shift forks, got our two shift rails, and then our two shift rail caps. One element that I would recommend grabbing for reassembly is some kind of assembly lube. What I have found for me locally was this Lucas Oil Products assembly lube. This works really great for all types of reassembling things, especially in the transmissions. So this is what I'm going to go with. First step is to reinstall the first and reverse shift rail. For the first and reverse, second and third shift rail, what I've found is the most indicative way of being able to tell the difference between the two is the first and the reverse shift rail. One is longer. Two, if you look at the various sides of the shift rails, you'll notice that the pin that holds the shift rail into place is at the very top part of the shift rail. The second and the third is more mid shift rail. So that's an easy way of being able to decipher between the two if you didn't mark them when you took these two apart. Insert the shift rail into the bottom part of the housing, right at where the poppet would be installed. Give your poppet spring a little bit of lube. Insert that and push that down into the actual cavity, and then I'm going to put a little bit of lube just on this poppet. I'm going to recommend putting this in a vise. So I'm going to try and push the poppet in while lifting up on the shift rail. So as you can tell, this is an effort, a coordinated effort. There. So by using a screwdriver to drive up through the shift rail and a punch to push the poppet into the spring, compress the spring, I was able to get the shift rail up past the poppet and the poppet spring to where it should hopefully, there. You can see how it locked into place. And If you look at your shift rails, you'll see that on the top facing plane of the shift rail, there's multiple grooves that are cut into it. And this is where the poppet rests, dependent on how you are operating the shift lever to engage that particular gear. Now we can install the shift fork. For the first and reverse shift rail, the lock pin or the roll pin is at the very top part of the shift rail, and so is the hole for the shift fork itself. So you want to rest that on the shift rail, and then you want to get a thin shafted screwdriver or punch or whatever that may be. Get those two elements aligned. I'm using my finger so that I can push that roll pin into the connected shift fork and the shift rail. So I'm going to take my 3/16 inch punch, and I'm reusing the roll pin from the disassembly. Once you get it to that point where it's actually aligned, then you can easily push it in with your punch. And we're in. Cool. Shift fork is attached. Once you get the first and reverse shift rail pin installed with the shift fork, then you want to slide it to the outside and get it into the neutral position. Neutral position means that this big notch in this shift rail, if you look at it from this perspective, is pointing straight through the shift lever's hole at the top of the housing. But before we install the shift rail for the second and third gear, you want to take your pill-shaped poppet, you want to insert that into the hole that's in between those two shift rail openings. Then you can take your second and third shift rail and install that through the bottom part of the housing. And before you do anything else, you want to install your shift fork, because once you get this shift rail installed, you have to have the shift rail in place. Otherwise, there's no other way to install it. I'm going to grease up my poppet spring, install that into that channel. I'm going to use a screwdriver to leverage up the shaft, insert the poppet. Alright, there we go. Shift rail is in place. Poppet is depressed into the spring. Spring is depressed into the housing, and the shift rail has been moved into position. Then you want to take your shift fork and work it down and work your shift rail up into position, move it into the neutral area. Then you can take your thin screwdriver and rotate the shift rail out to a position to where you can get it aligned using your finger as leverage to get the hole for the shift fork and the shift rail aligned, holding it in place, and then installing the roll pin. Once you get that started, then you can take your punch and rail it through. Sweet! Shift forks! Yay! Next step is to remove from said vise, flip it, reinstall in said vise, and install the caps. These caps are very simple. They have a little bit of an indentation in the middle, but the convex part, meaning the part that curves up and around, needs to point up and out of the casing. Just slide them into their respective holes. Pretty easy install. I'm going to use a wood block to punch them down into and flatten them out. remove said housing from vise, and then install the TCS plug and the reverse light switch. And now we have assembled the housing control cap. Moving on, we need to reassemble the main transmission case. And the assembly process starts with the reverse idler gear and the reverse idler shaft. A couple things to install here outside of the gear and the shaft. You're also going to need, which is going to be part of your new parts replacement kit, is your thrust washers. The thrust washers, there's 4 of them total, at least in the T150. With the reverse idler gear and the countershaft gear, the thrust washers are, if you look at them, very similar. But the reverse idler gear, the whole outer edge is round, where for the countershaft there's a flat edge to it, and you're also going to want to match these up with the actual shaft itself. This is a shot of the back facing part of the casing, looking into where the reverse idler gear will rest. Thrust washer, as you can tell, has this tabbed element in it. That rests inside of the casing, right in this top groove right here. So that way it doesn't rotate with the shaft. The reverse idler gear is going to have the straight aligned teeth facing towards the back part of the actual housing. But before I do that, I want to take some of my assembly lube, run it on the inside of the gear itself. I am going to tap it in with a rubber hammer. Alright, I've scooted around with this a couple times, and to make sure that you don't destroy your thrust washers, get everything aligned right, your reverse idler gear, put the casing, the housing, upright, and then look down through the shaft hole and take a screwdriver and get everything aligned right, pretty much just like this. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard, because you're fighting gravity, to get everything aligned perfectly. Once you get everything nice and set, then you can take your gear shaft, align it perfectly, and then tap it down through the housing. It's amazing how much easier this is. And we're in. Next step is to install the countershaft gear. Grab yourself some bearing grease. Line the inside of your countershaft bore, both ends. Then for each end of the gear, you're going to need 25 of your thin needle bearings. These, the thicker ones and the shorter ones, are the ones that go into the third gear with the input shaft. So just align these along the inner flange on the inside of the gear on both ends that the needle bearings rest against. The key here is that you don't want to have a gap between any of the needle bearings. Last one, slide that in. The kit that I got only came with one retaining ring. And this goes back to some kits have enough parts, more than you need parts, and other kits have less than you need. So I guess what I'm going to wind up doing is just going back and reusing the retaining rings from when I disassembled it. And that retaining ring should fit perfectly into that area. Right, now I'm going to do the other side. Retaining rings are the exact same size for both ends of the gear. So now we're looking at the inner part of the casing. And the thrust washer has two things that you need to be aware of when you install it. I'm just going to take some grease and adhere it to the side of the thrust washer that's going to connect to the casing. So you have your notch here. That notch goes into the slot carved into the casing here. And then when you actually put it into that position, you'll notice that the flat edge of the thrust washer should be pretty flush with this part of the casing right above the countershaft board. So that's why it's flat on that one edge and rounded everywhere else, because otherwise it would stick out, and I'm guessing it probably comes pretty close to the top main gear set. Now you can take your countershaft gear with the larger or largest gear facing up, or in this case towards the front of the casing, and slide that into place. Now that we've got the countershaft gear put into place with the thrust washers, now we're going to take the casing, flip it up on its side, and that countershaft is going to drop down a little bit into the bottom of the casing. And that is perfectly fine, because what we want it to do that, because what we need it to do is to open up the area back here so that we can assemble our entire main gear shaft assembly and then insert it into the housing. If we were to put the shaft into place and to lock in pretty much where this countershaft gear goes, then we wouldn't have the clearance back here to get that reverse synchronizing hub to be able to fit within this area. So let's put this together now. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to take our 3 main gears, the ones that have the synchronizing blockers or synchronizing rings on them. All 3 of these synchronizing rings have been replaced, but I'm reusing all the gears, the original gears, because they're in really good shape. But what I want to do is I want to take a thin strip of 600 sandpaper and just run it along the part of the gear where the synchronizing ring meshes. I just want to get that glaze off a little bit. I'm not going to be able to sand out whatever minor grooving is in there, but I just want to get a little bit of that glaze off, get it cleaned up a little bit so that the synchronizing rings have a better surface to grip to. Once we get that cleaned up, I'm going to take some assembly lube. I'm going to run a thin line of it around the inside of the synchronizing ring surface. That's some good. That looks good. Like it. Couple minor details that you should pay attention to whenever you're replacing elements on this and you're getting a new kit, whether it be a new gear, synchronizing rings, hubs, whatever that may be, locking rings. Keep the original set and then compare with the set that you got. So I've already done that for pretty much everything that I have that I've replaced, and I made sure that all the lock rings were exactly the same size, because some of them may have a different thickness to them, both this thickness and the radius thickness, and you want to make sure that everything is as matched up as it was originally. The one thing I will also note is that the synchronizing rings for the second and the third gear are the exact same in size, at least for the T150. The one difference that I did find, at least in the kit that I bought, this is the first and reverse synchronizing hub. Everything on here, this is the new set, is exactly the same. I checked measurements and so on. The one difference is on the inner ring of the synchronizing hub, the original has a slight raised ridge to it, just a touch. I want to say maybe 3 millimeters, 2 millimeters. That might even be 1 millimeter. But the new one doesn't have that. I don't know if that really does anything. It's just something to take note of. So when you're going through and you're putting this, you want to make sure that your tolerances are the exact same as what you're replacing, because certain kits come from different places. You could get a set that's from Italy and it might be slightly different than a set that would come from Taiwan. Not that the Taiwan is any better or any worse, or the Italy version is any better or any worse. There's just going to be slightly different tolerances according to the manufacturers. We're going to start with the first and reverse synchronizing hub. First thing I want to do is to run some assembly lubricant on the splines of the main shaft, or you could do it to the inside of the synchronizing hub, your choice. We're going to flip this up to where the front part of the main shaft is upwards, and the synchronizing hub has the shift fork ring facing up. I'm going to install this by hand, just slide it on, and then press this on to the point where this synchronizing hub butts up against the back part of this flange. An alternative way to install this is with a rubber mallet or a dead blow hammer. Something that is not metal, because the one thing you don't want to do is you definitely don't want to hit this ever with a hammer, because then you risk impaling the splines on the inside of the ring and also on the facing surface of the synchronizing hub. So you can just take a rubber mallet and back and forth, lightly tap it down. If I want to do it on a harder surface like wood. From here, then we want to insert our lock ring. Well, not the easiest install, but if you can get one of the edges around, then you can push it on the screwdriver and get the rest of it on there. Good thing that wasn't irritating. Alright, now we're going to move on to the first gear. So you want to take your first gear, synchronize or blocking synchronizer ring. Before we install the gear, you're going to want to do this pretty much for all of the ones moving forward. Run some assembly lube on the inner splines of all of this stuff. Then take your first gear with the meshing teeth, the oil slots facing towards the rear part of the drive shaft. Then you want to take your tang washer, tabbed washer, install that into the hole in the shaft. Then your next lock washer. Next is the second gear. This is applied with the outer meshing gear's teeth facing forward on the drive shaft. It just easily slides on there. And then last but not least, we're going to install the second and the third synchronizing hub. That just slides easily into place. Then you take your last remaining lock washer, put that into place. And there we go! Back to the way it used to look. Although I think this looks much better. One last remaining call out for this second and third synchronizing hub assembly. There should be a couple grooves slots cut into the forward facing part of the synchronizing hub. So that way you know what the orientation of this hub should be installed as, or where this raised flange is. Either one of those things, obviously, are supposed to be facing forward. Go ahead and check out how well your synchronizers mesh, how well the gears rotate on their own. How everything slides, integrates. Cool. Thumbs up, approved. For the rear adapter and bearing retainer, I was thinking that I was going to have to press this bearing out to replace it. But if you just take a 65mm punch, and once you've removed that retaining ring, then you can, just by hand, tap this thing out and through. And then you've removed your bearing. The original bearings for this transmission were made by Nachi in Japan. The rear one is part number 6307N C3. God, these things are so freaking cool looking. And that is a good bearing. So I'm going to run just a touch of assembly lube. And you can do this with grease, whatever you want. For the most part, just some kind of a lubricant, just to make sliding it in there a little bit easier. Then take your new bearing. I'm going to go with the 72. 72 is going to have a little bit larger spans, and it will reach around the outside of the bearing casing and provide us with a much more stable surface and not put as much stress on the inner bearing components. Okay, away we go. Guess that's why they call these things a bearing press. Installed. Oh man. Now I'm super geeked about that. Look how well that thing spins now. I'm so glad I decided to replace these bearings because I thought that the ones that were in there were in good shape. Now if you watch the disassembly video on this snap ring is a major pain in the butt. But what I did is I cut that groove into there like I said I was going to, so that I could easily get a screwdriver into that spot. To install the inner retaining ring for this rear adapter of the bearing, I was like, I have no idea how I'm going to do this, because how am I going to compress the ring to be able to fit inside of the adapter? So I just started screwing around with stuff. What you want to do is you want to take a punch or some kind of a flat edge piece and push the first edge of the ring down into the groove. Once it catches, then you want to move around and just kind of keep pushing it down and working it into the adapter and going along and using that as your guide. Alright, it's in. Wow. Yay. And you can see how I've cut that groove into the ring so that if I ever have to replace this bearing again, hopefully never, I can easily just take the screwdriver, insert it into that slot, and pull it out. So now we're going to take the assembly as we have it. We're going to flip it over carefully, because you don't want the gears and everything rattling around in there too much. And we're going to install the counter shaft. This may be a little bit of out of sync, but this just seems to be the best way to do it. So I'm going to install the counter shaft now. And to do that, I'm going to grab a pry bar. Seems to be a pretty viable option. Gives you a little bit better angle. Looking into the casing, I want to make sure that I've got my alignment right. Then I want to take my counter shaft and insert that into the back, through the back of the housing, and just lightly tap it in. Another thing to take note here is the roll pin hole. You're going to want to try and align it as much as you can visually with where it's going to wind up when it's inside and seated inside of the housing, so that you can get your roll pin inserted into that. This is going to be kind of a process to make this all happen, but it's going to be very difficult to rotate this shaft once it's actually seated inside of the housing. So I'm going to just try and visually align this using a screwdriver. Alright, then I'm just going to lightly tap it in. A little bit more. Okay. And there we go. Now I've got it just on the edge. Alright, so as I'm inserting this and moving it into the final resting place, I am making sure that I've got the alignment on the shaft. Alright, perfect. Now I want to flip the casing back over. This is not light. Now we've got everything in place. Counter shaft is set. And now we can install the front and the rear bearing adapter. Right, taking the main drive shaft, or the main, I guess this would be the clutch shaft, right? Install the new bearing on it, and then put the outer lock ring on that one. Man, that thing rotates so nicely. And then put the outer snap ring, lock ring, that holds the bearing into place. Now what I need to do is to apply the needle bearings, but you don't want to use chassis grease or anything else. You want to use something that's basically petroleum jelly. So I'm going to use this Super Lube, the synthetic grease, because you want to make sure that there's a hole that's been drilled into this clutch shaft. This is the gear oil circulation port, and if you put some heavy-duty grease in here, that port winds up getting clogged up by that grease. So you want to have something that is very light, kind of petroleum based, so that the oil circulates easily through these bearings. Just finished up installing the last of the pin bearings in the top of this. I just went with the assembly lube. It's got enough of a grip, and all of these bearings, these pin bearings, wind up forming a support system where they won't fall in. Adding on my last synchronizing blocker, making sure that the grooves and the teeth are pointing towards the inside of the casing. Then I'm going to take my main drive assembly. I'm going to insert this. What you want to try and accomplish is the gears on this clutch shaft, this main shaft, to engage with the counter shaft below, and that way you can get it inserted. So just kind of have to work it back and forth until you can get those teeth meshed. And then at this point, all we need to do is just take a rubber mallet and push this into place. And it should fall into place fairly easily, all the way until you can get that outer lock ring seated on the outside of the casing. And we're in. Right, I'm at a decision point right now, because what I'm supposed to do, or what you're supposed to do, is to put on the rear adapter and bearing assembly, and then push that in with a rubber mallet into the housing. And then, which actually was supposed to come before putting in the clutch shaft. But I've tried this, and I can't get the bearing to slide all the way up and over the shaft, because there seems to be a little bit of a, I don't know, it's like a slightly larger radius of the shaft at the point where the bearing's supposed to fit over it. So I can't press this on to the shaft, and if I hammer this in, you know, seat this onto the shaft, I can't get enough of a resistance from the rest of the shaft, and it just pushes it out this way. So my solution to that is I'm going to install the front bearing, or the front bearing cap, and to do that we actually need to install the seal. But my hope is that when I install this, it will hold all of this in place, so then I can seat the rear bearing assembly. Fingers crossed. There's a very small seal, oil seal, that fits inside of the front bearing cap. This has to be set down below and seated into this lower flange, and that with the depth of the seal, you have to have a bearing or seal press that's small enough to fit inside of this cap area, but big enough to where it will fit over the edge of the seal. I think one that I've got right now is let's see, 39.5 millimeters. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add, even though this stuff has a gasket type material put on the outside of these seals, I'm going to add just a little bit more anaerobic gel just to be extra safe. I'm not putting a ton of it on there. I'm just using some black RTV just as an extra precaution sealant. Insert the seal with the gasket part of it, the inner lined spring seal facing inside, and then lightly tap it in. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the bigger one first, just to get flush seated. And once I get that all into place, then I'll use the smaller one and set it all the way down. All you need to do is make sure it's just seated. When you take a look at it, it's set in there pretty deeply. Now, we need to install this onto the front of the case. Want to make sure that your oil drain port is facing down and over the top of this lower hole. Once we've got that seated in there, I'm going to use some assembly lube, get this all nice and greased up, pack it in there pretty well. Then we want to grab our gasket. Thing to take note of on the gasket is the gasket also has got a notch that will pair up nicely with that oil channel. I'm going to just put on a light coat of RTV. You do not want to put a ton of this stuff on here. You're just getting a light seal. Again, this is not a pressurized component. We're just sealing it up so that nothing leaks out. Alright, got some pretty good coverage there. So I'm going to put this on the housing first. I've just got a nice little setup of RTV around the casing part of the gasket. Really kind of want to get it around the bolt holes. Now that I've got that all done, slide it onto the clutch shaft. Now I'm going to install the bolts with the lock washer on them, but I'm not going to torque them down to their specified torque. I'm just going to install them enough to where I can get the 8 RTV can set up. We got that set up. Let's rotate this around. Install the rear assembly and adapter. To do this, the first thing you want to do is to put on your rear spacing ring and then the oil slinger, and we want to install our rear counter shaft cap. I'm going to add a light coating of RTV as a sealant. Lightly tap that into place. You'll be able to hear when it's seated, you get a kind of a flat, dull metal sound. Now comes the challenging part. Installing this rear bearing adapter onto this without being able to press it on, just because this bearing fits pretty snugly on top of the rear shaft. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in a vise, and I'm just going to use a butane torch, and I'm going to heat the inner ring, just the inner ring, to about 200 degrees, maybe 225, and then I'm going to quickly install it onto this and push it on, just with a rubber mallet. And I'm hoping that by expanding this inner ring enough, it will slide easily on and into the proper position on the main drive shaft. I got the bearing heated up to 200 degrees, a little bit over, and now I'm going to install it while it's still flexible. Alright, want to go until that outer snap ring is flush with the transmission casing housing. At that point, we should be installed. Now, you may ask why I had these screwdrivers in the gear set. What I was finding is that when I had, this is the third time I've done this, when I was installing this, I was pushing the main shaft along with the adapter as it was mounting onto the main shaft, and pushing the synchro rings in. And then I wasn't able to turn the gears because basically the synchronizing blocking rings were meshed too tight. So what I wanted to do was to leave something in there that would provide a little bit of a gap so that I would push the adapter onto the shaft without compressing the whole gear set. Install your gear, your transfer gear, washer, and then gear nut. This is supposed to be attached at 150 foot-pounds. Well, to do that, you're going to have to take your synchronizers and engage them into the first gear and the third gear. Okay, 150 foot-pounds onto something that you can't physically hold down is not easy. And I don't think I got close to it. I think I probably got to about 100, maybe 120. I'm going to have to wait before I put this thing on the actual Jeep mounted before I finalize this. But there is one thing that I want to point out. Learn from my mistakes and my lack of knowledge, so that you don't go through the same thing that I just went through. I just spent the past 3 hours trying to figure out why the inner components of this thing were locking up when I had applied the cap and when I had applied the rear adapter bearing. It was kind of hard to get the synchronizing rings engaged so that I could put this into place. But I had taken this thing apart 4 times trying to figure out if I had the spacing wrong or whatever. And the screwdrivers that you saw in the gears a few minutes ago is very indicative of what I've just been going through. So I just decided to just move on, and apparently by applying this lock nut at the end of the shaft pulls the main drive shaft just a touch, maybe a millimeter or two that way, and then that gives a nice amount of in-play to the synchro rings right here. I wasn't getting that before. Before I had put on that last nut, all of this stuff was immovable, and I couldn't even slide the synchro rings. It was just too difficult to do because they were too tight. Now I am in a much better place, and look how smoothly everything rotates. So all that frustration that I spent in the past 4 hours could have easily had been avoided if I just would have gone through the whole process, put on the lock nut, and just be done with it. Anyways, learning process. There we go. Everything is installed. I think I need to go take a nap. Before we move on to anything else, I wanted to let you know that these bolts, the ones that hold in the front cap, are supposed to be torqued to 35 foot-pounds. Now, moving on, the last remaining thing that we need to do is to install, well, actually it's over here, we need to install the roll pin into the counter shaft. You want to make sure that you wait till everything is assembled and everything has been torqued in right before you install that pin, because there's no way of getting it out other than punching it through and starting over. So the way that I'm going to put this in is I'm just going to grab a pair of forceps and I'm going to stick it down into the hole, because the hole in the casing is actually bigger than the roll pin, which is nice because it makes it easy to get it in there. And then you want to take a 5/16 punch, or you could go bigger if you wanted to. You just want something that's a fair amount bigger than the, what is it, the 3/16 inch roll pin. And then you want to install it to where this punch bottoms out on the casing, and then you can use your much smaller 3/16 punch to finish off the job. One of the things that I did do, sorry I'm bringing it up now, is in the kit that I got, there were, I think, 3 different lengths of that roll pin, all the same size. So what I did is I went with the one that was a little bit longer than the radius of the counter shaft, so that I would have a little bit of it sticking out on the far side and a little bit sticking out on this side, so that it, obviously wouldn't rotate. Now we can start finishing up the smaller pieces. So I'm going to put in all of the caps that go around. The one thing I did want to point out, and I didn't do this before because I didn't realize it because it was coated in so much stuff, the drain plug actually has a magnet built into it, which was kind of nice. So that is one thing to take note of, is that the drain plug and the casing both have magnets in them. Alright, getting closer to the finish line. Let's install the shift housing. You're going to need your gasket from your kit. Before we do any of that, I'm going to put some RTV on it, both sides. Once you got the thing all greased up, take your housing and in one swoop install it onto the shift rails and align it with your gasket. Now start with your guide pin and then install the rest of your bolts. One thing you can do is, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, is you can install a little bit of RTV on the bottom threads, very bottom thread of the bolts, because these bolts go right into the cavity of the casing. It's a drill through. So as a result, what will happen is that oil will eventually work its way up and out. So by putting the RTV on the threads, you're effectively sealing them, and it's not really going to bind up anything. I mean, these things aren't fine thread, and they're not applied at any particular pressure. I think it's like 15 foot-pounds. I'll check on that in a minute. 22 foot-pounds. Now let's go ahead and install the housing with the shift rod on it. The only thing that's remaining, and I still have to get one, is the reverse light switch, and that is installed at 18 foot-pounds. I believe we want to start with our alignment pins. I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to use some super lube for these in particular, just because they're not really lubricant oriented, but I want something that's going to keep them in place. Then take your main shift rod, shift lever, install that down into the shift rails, which should be in the neutral position at this point. I'm just going to put a bunch of lubricant over the top of this thing. I'm going to keep the original oil seal, or whatever this thing is. It seems to be made out of leather. If I find a replacement for this, I will put it in the description, but this thing, I don't really know what else to do with it. I guess I could cut another one, but this one actually seems to be in, usable shape. So I'll just slide that back onto the shaft. Then goes your washer, then your spring, Now, I'm actually going to put a little bit of grease on the spring too. Of course, now I got to clean all that grease off the shaft. Then you put your cap. And then your screw cap on top of that. And then just simply push down, engage the threads, and screw it on. Right. There's no way of torquing this thing down, so I don't know if there's any particular alignment that it's supposed to be on. It's a little offset as far as like the square-sided edges. I don't really care. It doesn't really fit into anything in particular. But now, let's see if we can get through our shifts. Second, third, reverse, first, reverse, first, second, third. Everything's installed. We just completely rebuilt our T150. How cool is that? Yay us. So in the process of doing some extra research, apparently the T150 from 76 to 79, I believe, there was maybe the possibility of some modifications of the casing itself and how it mated up with the Dana 20. I've heard, and there are other people that have posted this stuff, at least with mine, with the T150 79 version, there's a gasket on the back here, and there's also these ports that go through and into the casing. When this is mated up with the Dana 20, then this gasket goes over those holes and kind of seals them up. So what that means is that there's no real fluid exchange between the T150 and the Dana 20. This all relates back to that oil slinger, that big simplified washer that we put back on to this adapter in between that and the Dana 20 engagement gear. Now the question at hand is where that oil slinger should go. According to my manual, between the rear bearing and the inner spacing washer, main spacing washer. So right into this area. When I took this apart, that oil slinger was on the outside of the bearing, in between that and this rear gear. So I guess to a certain degree, you know, you have to take in consideration, was there a possibility that somebody had done this before, done something on this before, and didn't put the slinger in the right place? And what purpose does the slinger actually provide? Because it doesn't seal. There's a gap around it, and fluid can get in and out fairly easily for the most part, whether it's on the inside of the case or the outside of the case, because that fluid can go through the bearing. To further that conversation, if this gasket is built for, and I don't know if this gasket is a universal gasket, like it's supposed to have holes for these ports so that the fluid can flow between the Dana 20 and the T150 or not. I've read various posts about guys that have a 76 or a 78, and that there's no exchange between the Dana 20 and the T150 as far as the lubricants go, because I guess the T150 sits much higher or much lower than the Dana 20. I really don't have a lot of understanding behind all of it. All that I do know is that according to my manual, the oil slinger is supposed to be on the inside of the case. It remains to be seen if that's a problem when I install this. So I just want to put that out there for you as the viewer, that when you take yours apart, there's a possibility that that oil slinger will be in a different spot, whether outside of the adapter, inside of the adapter, or if it's even there at all, or if somebody had rebuilt it before, put one in, took one out. There's also apparently a rear seal that's supposed to go in where this adapter is, but that must be a completely different transmission, because if that's the case, then this rear adapter bearing assembly wouldn't even fit into this section. So I don't really know all of that. I just showed you what I was presented with, what my service manual said, and it's for a 79. Take it for what it's worth. What I would love to hear is for you have taken this on and what year yours is. Put it in the comments and let me know what you find, because I would really like to document all of this stuff, because that's going to help out all of us, especially the ones with the T150 and the older model CJs. Because honestly, I don't want to rely on a bunch of posts by some guys that have had their Jeep since 82 or whatever it is, and they've done all this and they know all more than everybody else does. Really have to debate that they know more than the service manual. So anyways, put it in the comments. Let me know how things are working out for you. I'm thrilled that we got to this point. I'm really excited to put this into the CJ, in a few months, and hopefully that oil slinger doesn't come into a problem. Well, that concludes another episode of Jeeping with Cool Guy. Like and subscribe. It helps me out. It helps the CJ7 community out. It helps everybody out. Looking forward to the next episode.